Welcome. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. My name is Yvonne Crenshaw, and thank you for joining me for this 1-hour session on counseling for performance problems. I'm so happy to be speaking to CMI graduates. You're like me and you understand the importance of continuous learning. It helps make the world a better place. Of course, it gives us more opportunity, and I think it just helps our quality of life. Today, I hope to add to that treasure trove of information that you already have. Although I'll be sharing information geared towards the supervisor, even if you're not currently one, you'll find the information valuable to you personally, because it's all about communication. Counseling for performance problems is also called constructive criticism. It's called negative feedback. It's one of the toughest jobs that we have as supervisors. And when we do it, it requires quite a bit of focus and commitment. When we do it right, we can see a change. We can help the employee in our work unit. But when we get it wrong, oh boy, that's a problem. And what was previously a good relationship might turn into a sour one. The behavior continues, or perhaps it even worsens. One or two bad actors in a work unit can cause all kinds of turmoil, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. So it's critical for us to deal with our performance issues as soon as possible. Let's look at our goals for today. I think let's look at our goals for today, okay? All right. There you go. All right. To provide an overview of the counseling process, to share insight into 2 counseling concepts. So the first part of this session, I'll be talking about the why, the when, and the how of performance counseling. During the second half, I'll provide a brief overview of 2 different approaches to giving feedback. One of these is radical transparency, and the other one is the feedback fallacy. I hope you'll be able to stick around for this second half, because I think it'll be very interesting. Because of time constraints, I will focus only on the non-disciplinary side of counseling and not the disciplinary action that we know can often be a result of the counseling session. Documentation is also critical to a counseling session when required. Our counseling memos, written notices, follow-up emails, all of these are important parts of establishing, of course, a record for progressive discipline. So we'll keep that in mind. I'm sure that that's just a review for most of you, but it's always good to remember that that's important. Sorry about that. All right, so the what and the why of performance counseling. Here's a definition of performance counseling, and you probably recognize it. I'll read this. It says, performance counseling is the one-on-one interaction between supervisor and employee, during which the supervisor provides staff with positive or negative feedback regarding job performance. It is meant to be a positive communication device, clarifying what has occurred and what is expected. So I like that. It's supposed to be a positive communication device. The process of sitting down with your staff, one-on-one, having that conversation about a problem, it gives her or him the opportunity to really face the issues and hopefully correct behavior, whatever that might be. When do we perform performance counseling? Well, we don't want folks running in and out of our office all the time. We don't want to be micromanagers. So when we think about performing performance counseling, we need to be very thoughtful and deliberate about when we decide to do so. Here are some things to consider. Number one, you might do it when established performance objectives outlined on the EWP aren't being met. So things like missing deadlines, loss of productivity, pattern of accidents, pattern of errors, waste of materials, poor judgment, difficult recalling detailed instructions. Number two, when a pattern of negative behavior or poor work habits develops, for example, tardiness, absenteeism, unscheduled absences, excessive social time, excessive personal phone calls, unprofessional conduct, poor employee relations, rudeness to others, and gossip. And then finally, when one incident is severe enough to warrant counseling promptly after the incident. So all of those are reasons when you might want to actually have a counseling session with one of your employees. So how do we conduct a counseling session? Well, in my book, it starts with the relationship. And I think this is a great quote that really speaks to the relationship. No matter how many or how urgent your multiple responsibilities may be, one must take priority over all others. Your responsibility to build and maintain a productive relationship with each employee under your immediate supervision. No other single responsibility demands the same degree of attention. I think that's pretty powerful, and I think it really speaks to exactly that, the relationship. As some of you have probably experienced, a poor relationship with one of your employees can really cause a problem on your team. And this negativity can not only disturb the work of your workforce and what happens at work, but also can carry over into your own personal life at home. Everyone's not capable of leaving work at home. And so when we do have these issues with our staff, and we do have poor relationships with our staff, it does affect our home life as well. But when we can create that respectful and hopefully positive relationship, with an employee and with all of our employees, a wonderful, respectable one. It's that sense of trust that we create, that sense of trust that that employee has, that we empathize with them, that we really care about their heart. That kind of environment that really helps to nurture and create a space where we can have those really honest conversations with our staff. So that relationship is critical for your success during counseling sessions. Also, when you get a new employee, the same thing applies. When they come through the door, you should immediately begin to work on establishing, and I mean carefully work on establishing a good relationship with that employee as soon as possible. Steps of the performance counseling process: prepare, share, ask, listen, review expectations, agree on a plan of action, offer your support, and follow up. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Prepare, of course, prepare. So when you prepare, you want to really have a positive approach to your preparation. This sounds pretty obvious, I think, but if you and that employee have had difficulties in the past there may be some feelings present. It's important to clear your mind. Sometimes an employee's behavior may cause us to be angry, frustrated, even humiliated. Maybe your boss has ringed you out because of something that your employee did. So we have to try to be optimistic and have a really good goal in mind when we go into that performance counseling session. We have to get rid of our emotional baggage. As a supervisor, it's up to you to keep the conversation civil, even if your employee does not. Remember, even the most challenging employees have some positive qualities. So try to focus on those and place yourself in the right mindset. So let's consider some questions that we might think about before we go into that counseling session as preparation. Number one, how do I see the situation? What assumptions am I making? What stories am I telling myself? How might the other person perceive the same situation? What emotions is this problem stirring up for me? What is the impact of this situation on me, and what theory do I have about the other person's intention? Number two, be certain this is a conversation worth having, and that's really one to really think about. What is the purpose in addressing this issue, having this conversation? Is it because you just want to ridicule the employee? You just want to wag your finger and say, I told you so? Those things you need to really consider, and if you answered yes to those, you may not need to have a conversation with that person. The same goes for the next one, that second bullet. What will likely happen if I ignore this problem? How will I feel? Now, I think we know that some problems can be ignored. I mean, every now and then there's problems that come up that, you know, a person is just having a moment. It's really not that significant. And we can let it go, and we can ignore it and just move on. But we have to think about, how will you feel? How will I feel if I do that? How will I feel if I let that problem go? Am I still going to be carrying resentment? Or as some people say, am I going to feel some way about it? If I am, that does not mean that I now need to have a conversation with that person. What that often means is that I need to deal with my own emotional issues that I might have concerning a situation and be able to let it go, whether it means that you go somewhere and vent to someone or whatever you need to do in order to move past it. And then finally, how is this problem affecting the productivity and morale of my unit? And always the productivity, and of course the morale, but particularly the productivity, you want to consider when you're performance counseling, because everything should be spoken in terms, or should be, let's say, framed in how it is going to impact the work. If you keep the work the focus, then you're less likely to get yourself in trouble by really being subjective and really giving a lot of your opinions about situations. So the next step, share. And I like to use the SBI feedback model when I share. Situation, behavior, impact. It's a great tool to use. It helps keep us on track, and it really covers the bases. Situation. When you're giving feedback, first define the where and the when of the situation you're referring to. This puts the feedback into context for your employee. It gives a person, you know, a frame of reference. So, for example, you might want to give someone some comments about something they did during a presentation. You say, during yesterday morning's team meeting, when you gave your presentation. So now they know exactly what you're talking about, when it occurred. Or something like at the client meeting on Monday afternoon. Bottom line is that you want to be very clear about what you're about to discuss with them. Next thing, behavior. Your observations, not your interpretation. Now, the specific behaviors that you want to address, this can be the most challenging part of the counseling session, because you must communicate only the behaviors that you observe directly. You must not make assumptions or subjective judgments about those behaviors. These could be wrong, and they will ultimately undermine your feedback. For example, suppose you observe a colleague make a mistake during presentation. You don't assume just immediately, well, they probably didn't even prepare for this presentation. I know what's going on. That's very subjective in nature. Instead, you simply comment on the mistakes that they made. And ideally, you should have actually taken some notes to be specific when you actually confront them with them. An example of using specific description would be to say something to the effect: during yesterday morning's team meeting, when you gave your presentation, you were uncertain about 2 of the slides and your calculations were incorrect. Very specific, very direct observation. And they can speak to that. You want to always think about trying to make these observations of their behavior measurable, just like we do with our performance objectives on the EWP. If you keep them measurable, then once again, they're clear and less subjective. And then finally, the impact. How did the other person's action affect you? And how did it affect others? What did it make you feel? Those kinds of things. Additionally, when you're talking about sharing, you may want to use I statements instead of you statements. These can help you avoid assumptions, and they could help you actually stay out of the fray. That is, you won't upset your employee if you try to use these I statements instead of you statements, and you can protect the relationship that way. You statements tend to be received defensively. They sound like they're blaming, judging, or assuming things that may not be true. An I statement lets the employee respond with his or her perspective on the situation. With I statements, we can still be assertive, but they allow less hostile, more compassionate ways to communicate. So let's look at these. Instead of saying this, you did this, you could say, this is what I observed. Instead of, you shouldn't have done that, here's how I think. And instead of, you must be crazy, and I hope none of us are crazy enough to ever say that, it's important. We could say it's important we talk about this. So those are just some of the examples that you might use using I statements. You know, when you structure your feedback in this way, using the SCI model and trying to use these I statements, your people will understand precisely what you're commenting on and why. When you outline the impact of their behavior on others, when you're giving them a chance to reflect on their actions and think about things, they're more likely to actually change the behavior because they really have a real clear picture of what has happened and how it's impacted the work unit. All right, continuing the steps of the performance counseling. Ask, of course, we're going to ask questions. Ask the employee for his viewpoint as to what happened and how he can correct it. Emphasize your interest in working well and hearing their point of view. Consider using language such as, I would like to understand where you're coming from on that communication with the vendors, or can you say a little bit more about how you see things about the project timeline? You see that the way you're coming across is inviting, and that's the way it should be, inviting. Including them in the conversation is important. It shows them that you value their opinions and that you don't have some kind of hidden agenda. Listen. Now, we all know that active listening is a critical part of any conversation. How many times do we have to hear about active listening? I guess you're saying, here it is again. Well, I guess we just have to keep hearing about it until we actually do it. I know some of us still have a problem with listening from time to time. If we listen, this, of course, is our opportunity to gain information, and we're going to listen with curiosity. And I always like that word curiosity, because when you're curious, you really kind of dig down a little bit closer, because you really want to find out what's going on. And I think that's a wonderful word when you're thinking about actually listening. And of course, for clarity's sake, because in the conversation and with that person sharing, you'll learn something and hopefully clear up some things, particularly maybe about what their intentions were in the first place. All right, review behavior and performance expectations in a clear and non-threatening way. You'd be surprised at how many people do such a wonderful job of sharing what the issue is, of listening to the person give their comments on what has happened, but they don't ever share what their expectations are. And you'd be surprised. There's some sad have the employees out there who find this loophole. And so as you have called them in for a counseling session and talked all about what happened and how you feel about it, you have never mentioned what the expectations are, later on you'll hear about it. Well, you never told me what you wanted from me. Oh, I didn't remember you ever saying what it was that you wanted. So we have to be clear about expectations. We think it's something that we do ordinarily, but it's easily forgotten when we're in the midst of having one of these counseling sessions. And then agree on a plan of action by asking your staff for possible solutions and how the issue can be avoided in the future. We want to hear from our staff. We want to hear their suggestions and what their ideas are. Before we even give ours, we need to hear what theirs are. We might be surprised that some of the things that they come up with are the same things that we've been thinking. We need to show them that we actually value their opinion. Ask questions along the way. If the employee gives options, ask them, how are they going to go about accomplishing it? Really kind of get down into the detail if you need to. Also, a lot of what we do when we're in this counseling session and we're going through all of these different phases is that we're acting really more as a facilitator rather than an answer provider. All right, we're really directing the conversation and helping it move along. And that's an important part of what we do, and it's an important skill set for us to remember that we should have during these counseling sessions. We are not the talking head here. We should be doing a lot of listening and a lot of asking questions, and make sure that we do that well. So after we've agreed on the plan of action, offer support, appropriate assistance to the employee, and express confidence in the employee in making the necessary corrections. And when it says offer support, and look at that word appropriate, because that, I think, is important to know exactly what kind of resources and what kind of support you are able to provide that employee. Finally, set a follow-up date to review progress, depending upon the situation. And if you actually set a follow-up date, follow up. If you're a person who touches base with your employees on a regular basis, and it might just be you just kind of stopping by their office and saying, hey, how's such and such going? Hey, thank you for working on that. Thank you for correcting that, whatever it is. But let them know that you are still engaged, that you still care about what's going on in their world. So those are the steps of the performance counseling process. I know a lot of this was just a review for you. And of course, we could go on and on probably for all day talking about all the steps and all the details. But that's it for now. And so if you have any specific questions about those steps, please feel free to contact me and let me know, and I'll be happy to address those with you. But now let's look at some other approaches to feedback. The two are radical transparency and the feedback fallacy. Before I get into this, as a disclaimer, I just want you to know that I am not promoting either approach. However, I am a thought leader, and so what I like to do is bring to my audiences new information. And so what you can do is either reflect on it, maybe experiment with it, or if you like, just reject it. So first, radical transparency. True growth and development occurs when companies and individuals are radically truthful and unabashedly honest. This is Ray Dalio of Bridgewater Associates. Let me tell you something a little bit about radical transparency. It's a philosophy, it's been around for a long time, but it's discussed in some length in this book by Ray Dalio. It's called Principles. Now, to give you some perspective on Mr. Dalio and Bridgewater Associates, Mr. Dalio is the head of Bridgewater Associates, and Bridgewater Associates is the largest hedge fund in the world, not just in the United States, but in the world. So that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective of who we're dealing with here. And his belief about being honest and open. A lot of what I'm going to share with you is based on an article from the Harvard Business Review written by Francisco Gino, and it was entitled, Radical Transparency Can Reduce Bias, but Only If It's Done Right. And what Ms. Gino does is she discusses Ray Dalio's experience using radical transparency in Bridgewater. So let's look at a definition before we get into what went on at Bridgewater and radical transparency. So this is a definition I pulled off the web, and there's quite a few of them out there. Radical transparency is a phrase used across fields of governance, politics, software design, and business to describe actions and approaches that radically increase the openness of organizational process and data. It is the idea that if everyone knows everything, it could be a major driver of increased organizational performance. So right before I get into Dalio, though, I know that you guys are aware of transparency. In fact, when I conducted a training, I always hear, I've got to be transparent. We must be transparent. I'm transparent. Transparency is everything. So we get it. We get the idea of transparency. But Mr. Dalio, he takes it a step further with radical transparency. The story is that he was receiving a lot of complaints from his confidants that he was hurting business. And he was hurting business because he was being too brutally honest with his employees. And he thought that, wow, this is really a tragedy, because he says, you know, people have a lot of ideas and opinions, but they didn't have any way to actually find out, actually process them and examine them. They didn't have any way to say what's true and what's not. And therefore, what we got was a distortion of what the truth was. So what Dalio decided to do at Bridgewater Associates, he began to meet individually with each of his employees. And he sat down and he talked to them, and he decided that he wanted to create a different kind of culture at Bridgewater. And I quote, this is what he said. He wanted everyone to engage in thoughtful disagreement. Thoughtful disagreement. So they could exchange ideas without any lasting conflict, even when the ideas were controversial. It didn't matter who you were in what pecking order you were in, what your rank or what your file was, wherever you were in that organization. Everyone was fair game. He wanted everything out in the open, mistakes, weaknesses, so everyone could take a look at them. Thus, he began a culture at Bridgewater of radical transparency. Why do humans need radical transparency, you might say? Why do we have to go this far where we're just saying everything and putting everything out there? Well, according to Dalio, we evaluate information in a biased manner. 2, we often do not realize that these biases weaken our judgment and decisions. We are not as self-aware as we think we are. And 3, we don't receive negative feedback well. So let's look at these a little bit. We evaluate information in a biased manner. Well, think about it. Anybody ever heard of confirmation bias? That's where we have a tendency to seek out and interpret in favor and recall information in a way that confirms our own personal beliefs and assumptions, rather than looking for information that contradicts it. It's just the way it is. This isn't just an anomaly. This is actually empirically supported. This is a scientific notion of cause that does exist. Number 2, the fact that we often don't realize that these biases weaken our judgment and that we are not as self-aware as we think we are. I don't know about you. Think about it for a minute. Do you think you're pretty self-aware? I'd like to think I'm pretty self-aware. It shows that we aren't. In fact, what research says is that the higher someone goes up the ladder, the less self-aware he becomes. I think that's very interesting. We just have a tendency to think highly of ourselves, which I don't know about you, but whoever said that was a bad thing to think highly of yourself? Who knew it was bad? I guess the whole point is balance, just to have some kind of balance. And number 3, we don't receive negative feedback well. Well, I don't think that's shocking to anyone. Most of us don't like to get negative feedback. We like people who support us, who talk about our positive qualities. You know, that's our feel-good moment. When people will give us evidence that is different than how we see ourselves, we often find it threatening, and we want to remove the threat. We disassociate from those people. We want to disassociate from that source of information. Hey, supervisors, often that source of information and that negative feedback is, guess who? It's us. So don't be surprised when our staff kind of moves away or disassociates or gets a little bit disconnected with us when we're sharing negative feedback. Who likes to discuss weaknesses or mistakes with your supervisor or with anyone else with any frequency? Not too many of us. In most instances, we are far more comfortable focusing on the positive, not the negative, even if focusing on the negative would be better for us. So, radical transparency. Here's the solution according to Dahlia. We should embrace the harsh realities of existence. Pretty cruel and cold, isn't it? The harsh realities. Okay. We must make our biases known and then make it okay to discuss them. A very interesting case of this, of using radical transparency, is Netflix. Yes, Netflix uses radical transparency. In fact, it uses it so well that it's currently under fire because it does use radical transparency. At Netflix, mistakes and evaluations are open to everyone. Unlike most private companies, the executive staff have access to everyone's salary. There's no annual review at Netflix. Instead, everyone is encouraged to constantly give one another blunt criticism, sometimes abrasive feedback throughout the year. They also have a custom called sunshining, where employees are encouraged to regularly air their mistakes that they make. I laughed when I thought about this, that you regularly air your mistakes. And one of the things that they mentioned was the job interview. And everyone knows that question. They love to answer on a job. About we just hate to deal with that part of ourselves. But Netflix, not at Netflix, all right, they discuss your biggest weaknesses. Netflix also has the keeper test, where managers are asked to tell what employees they would fight for. They say that some of the employees at Netflix sometimes feel that the managers are being so pressured to fire people that because the managers don't want to appear soft. So managers will just fire people. Now we know that Netflix is remarkably successful. In fact, they say that Netflix has changed the entire TV and film industry. Although the atmosphere there may not be very pleasant, it is extremely effective. They have a very high standard of performance, and believe it or not, they have a very low voluntary attrition rate. People just don't leave there. They say it's around 3%. The reality is this type of somewhat cutthroat, high-performing culture works. Places like Netflix and Bridgewater Associates, they're high pressure. But this environment is not the only way for an organization to be successful, and we know that because we work at these organizations. And places like the ones we work in, we share a mix of talent, and we tend to care more about the individual values and feelings. Wherever we work, though, there always is going to be something we have to deal with. Netflix may not be the place for us, but it is definitely a place of high energy and adventure, and probably high reward. Radical transparency, it's not for everyone, but sometimes it's this statement. When transparency unveils our universal biases, we are more likely to benefit as individuals. Our organizations will benefit as well. So that's kind of just a better radical transparency. Even when companies are transparent with consumers, we tend to view them better. They gave an example of a hospital that published all of its surgical procedures on its website, and immediately business boomed. People were flying from all over the country to have their surgical procedures performed there. What it meant that maybe it was perceived that this particular hospital maybe was more trustworthy than other hospitals because it did publish its surgical rates. Or maybe in some way people actually thought that it might be a safer place. So that kind of transparency in business often can work. And if you've seen some organizations that have gone through crises and whatever, and they're very transparent. I still remember, I think it was Tylenol years ago that had that problem, and they were very transparent with how they handled that, and Tylenol is still on the shelves today. So transparency can work, and it can be beneficial. The more open we are to talk to one another, the more we're willing to challenge ideas. And when we challenge ideas, often we can lead to better solutions. You know, I guess the bottom line with radical transparency is that in order to incorporate it, radical transparency, into our work life, I think many of us would probably definitely have to toughen up. But I'll let you make a decision about that. But that's what I think. I don't think that the way we exist right now, for many of us, radical transparency might be something that might not be favorable in our workplace. All right, let's look at our second approach to feedback, and that is the feedback fallacy. The basic premise of the feedback fallacy tell employees what we think of the best. In fact, it's detrimental to progress. Now, this information is taken from a recent March 2019 issue of the Harvard Business Review. I happened to be in the airport, and wow, voila, I saw this magazine that said the feedback fallacy. Well, all I do is talk about feedback and constructive criticism and coaching, all those things when I'm working, so it really got my attention. So two authors of this particular article, Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall, they take constructive feedback to task. Now, before you dismiss them as being just, Buckingham do say this, that it's still important to provide concrete instruction to your employee. So there we have it. As you remember, some of the list of things that I mentioned when we were talking about counseling sessions, those kinds of things, if they're warranted, counseling is needed, and it would fall under that category. But according to the writers, this is not the type of concrete counseling, well, this type of concrete counseling is not what we normally do, I should say. What we normally find ourselves doing is providing subjective analysis, our own personal evaluations of an employee's performance for somewhat abstract tasks like how to lead a team or create a strategy. So why is it a bad thing to give negative feedback? Why is it a bad thing to give constructive criticism? According to the authors, humans are unreliable and biased raters of other humans. Feedback is more distortion than truth. And you might have remembered, I said something about this truth being distorted. I did mention that when I was talking about radical transparency, and that was one of the things that Ray Dalio actually was concerned with, that there was a lot of distortion of the truth out there because people were not questioning people's ideas. Number two is that criticism inhibits the brain's ability to learn. Negative feedback takes us away from our comfort zones, and our brains stop paying attention to anything other than surviving the experience. Now, for those of you who are psychology majors, you probably have heard of those two nervous systems that we have. One is our sympathetic nervous system. The other one is our parasympathetic nervous system. Well, that sympathetic nervous system, that's where we get that sense of fight or flight. That's where it comes from. And when we're receiving negative feedback, we feel threatened, and that kicks in. We immediately want to distance ourselves, and we tend to close down. But on the other hand, it's our parasympathetic system that kicks in when we start dreaming and thinking about what we can achieve. It's that system that stimulates our sense of well-being, and learning happens here. That's where learning happens. Learning rests in what we know about doing well, and definitely not someone else's definition of wrong. Because what's happened up there with that first item, human beings are unreliable raters of other humans, think about it. When we give our perception and our analysis of something, we're doing it through our own eyes. And so when we share something with somebody, they have to get through all of that maze of information that is us in order to finally recognize something in it that is themselves. Contrary to popular belief, learning does not take place in our comfort zone, where learning does take place, in our comfort zones, where our neural pathways are more concentrated. What I was trying to get at is they always tell you, get out of your comfort zone. That's where you're going to grow, but not according to this article. According to this article, learning takes place in our comfort zone. That's where our neural pathways are most concentrated. That's where we're most open to possibility. That's where we're most creative, we're insightful, and that's where we're most productive, is in our comfort zone. Finally, number 3, we cannot correct a person to excellence. According to the authors, studying failure does not get us closer to defining what excellence is. Only studying excellence does that. So what should we be doing to help our employees if giving negative feedback is not one of those things? Well, number 1, look for successful outcomes. Excellence is an outcome. So we should take note of when a project goes right, an angry customer is calmed down, and when presentations go well. That's what we want to look for. And when we see that excellence in our employee, let them know it. Share our observation and reaction with the employee. And they tell a story about Tom Landry. And some of you may remember Tom Landry was the football coach of the Dallas Cowboys. I know some of you are like really cheering out there right now, so me too. But anyway, Tom Landry, when he saw his team was struggling and all the other teams were making videos of bad plays, he did just the opposite. He made individual tapes of each player when they were doing excellent tackles, making excellent passes, and he promised to only replay winning plays. Why did he do that? He did that so they could see their own pattern of excellence. Remember, when we give our opinions about somebody's pattern of excellence, we're seeing it through our lens, through our filters, through our experiences, through our education. But what Tom Landry got was that his folks, his players, they needed to see their own pattern of excellence. They needed to see what that looked like, have a visual of that. And when we share that with our employees, when we stop and we share that observation and reaction with our employee, it's not like when we stop and praise the employee and say, hey, good job. We're sharing merely an observation and a reaction, very clear, so then they can recognize themselves in it. Finally, number 3, recognize the difference between high priority interrupt and your highest priority interrupt. Now, we know as supervisors that we are interrupted all the time, and we constantly are trying to determine and balance which thing that we should really pay attention to. According to our authors, a high priority interrupt is when an employee does something wrong and you immediately have to address it. Very real, very clear cut. Yes, you have to deal with things, but this type of remediation is only about correction. And it is what it is. It's remediation. But remediation is not growth. Remediation, yes, it of course corrects the situation adequately, but does it in the real sense help that employee grow? According to our authors, excellence does not grow in remediation. Instead, know what your highest, and emphasis is on the EST part of high, know what your highest priority interrupt is. And that's when you stop, recognize excellence in your employee. It's there that that employee gets the idea of what excellence really looks like and feels like, and it becomes clear to her. That is truly your highest priority interrupt. And number 4, help employees to look at their past, present, and future by focusing on the what and not the whys. So if we help them focus on their past, what we're helping them do, because we have recognized these highest priority interrupts, we've recognized that those moments of excellence, we talk about it. We help them identify when in the past they've been excellent, what's been going on. You know, I don't know about you, but when I am training or doing some kind of a work with a client, my best, when I'm what they call in the pocket or in the zone or whatever you want to call it, sometimes you're so close to the action, you don't recognize what it is that you're doing so right. So that's why it's important for us as supervisors to slow down the action for a minute and let that person be able to identify with what was excellent and what they did. That's why that's so important. Excellence is idiosyncratic. Idiosyncratic. I had to practice that a couple of times this morning. But anyway, idiosyncratic, it's unique. It's peculiar to each of us. And according to the authors, it's up to us as supervisors to help our staff realize his or her own pattern of excellence. So by me sharing what I think is a quality performance, you know, it's okay. I can give my opinion. I have one. It's nothing wrong with me giving my opinion. But for that particular employee to really know what excellence looks like them and really discover what that pattern of excellence is in them, they need to figure it out and find it out for themselves. And what happens when they find it out for themselves? They keep repeating it. Now, if you show them what they did in the past, you also want them to see what they're doing right now that's working. So you have an opportunity right now when you go back to your office and you see your employee doing something excellent, you have an opportunity right now to stop and say, hey, more of that. Yes, that's what we want to see. And let them identify that excellence in themselves. And then, of course, when you're talking to them and you're discussing things that they might need to do in the future, what you do is help them to identify what is going to work for them. Because a lot of times they know what's going to work for them, particularly if we spend some time working on the excellence instead of working so much on the failures. If we start working on the excellence and they start, you know, actually tweaking things a little bit here, you know, having those little nuances in their behaviors, each time it gets better and better, they'll be able to identify what they need to do in the future. And not just them, us. So the next time your boss or your supervisor comes to you and says, hey, wow, Jason, I really appreciate that job you did today. That was fantastic. You might ask them, hey, would you like sharing with me, kind of exactly what it was that really worked for you? And it's not that you're trying to get more praise from your boss or anything like that, but what you're trying to do is get something tangible. You're trying to see, hey, what was excellent through his eyes? What did he see that worked? And then you can make notes of it. I know I start asking that. I've started to ask that, and I think it's made all the difference in the world. So that is the feedback fallacy. And as you can see, developing excellence is important. And it can be something that I think this particular one, I think is worth thinking about. Finally, final considerations for performance counseling. Always include these strategies when you're counseling. Don't personalize the situation or behavior. Concentrate on the facts. Be considerate and respectful of the other person. Develop productive alliances with others in the workplace. Be a good example. Be a good example. Be a good example. And why am I repeating that? Because I bet everybody who's sitting or listening within earshot of this have seen poor examples of supervisors and bosses and everywhere, and we have to work on being better examples. And then finally, remember the relationship comes first. If we get that good, strong relationship with that employee, we can get through a lot of tough times with an employee. So there you have it, a variety of viewpoints to consider. I hope you'll spend some time doing your own research on both the old and new approaches to feedback, even if it's only to dismiss whatever it is, or to validate that what you're doing with your employees is right on target and it's working well for your staff. And sometimes that's all we need to do. There's my information. Please feel free to contact me with any questions that you might have. If you would like more webinars like this, please let CMI know, or CMA know. And thank you for sharing your lunch hour with me. I know how important, how precious it is. I hope you have a great afternoon, and remember to always lead with love. Thank you.